The cold came first. It always did on the Normandy coast. Before the light, before the sound of gulls, before the smell of salt and wet stone, the cold arrived like a messenger from somewhere deeper and darker than the sea. It settled into the bones. It found the gaps in wool and leather. It reminded every man standing watch on that bluff that the Atlantic was not their ally, had never been their ally, and on this particular morning in early June of 1944, was about to become something far worse. Oberleutnant Franz Kellner pulled his field coat tighter and raised his binoculars to the horizon. Nothing. Just the gray pre-dawn sea, restless and churning from the tail end of a storm that had spent 2 days making everyone miserable. The water had that particular color it takes on before sunrise. Not quite black, not quite gray, but something in between that has no name in any language because no one wants to spend time naming things that feel like omens. Kellner was 32 years old, though he looked older. Men who had been to Stalingrad always looked older. It was not a matter of wrinkles or gray hair, though both had come early. It was something behind the eyes. A kind of settled awareness, a permanent adjustment to the fact that the world could end without warning, and often did. He had the lean, angular face of a man who had been cold and hungry long enough that his body had simply stopped pretending otherwise. His hands, wrapped around the field glasses, were steady. They were always steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere on the Eastern Front, replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. A calm that was not peace, but rather the absence of surprise. He had been assigned to the 352nd Artillery Regiment 8 months ago, transferred west after a wound to his left shoulder had disqualified him from the kind of combat the Eastern Front demanded. The doctors called it a lucky wound. He did not argue with them. He had stopped arguing about luck the day he watched 4 men he trusted completely disappear into a Soviet artillery barrage outside Kharkov, reduced in seconds from friends and soldiers to simply absent, as though they had never existed at all. Normandy was supposed to be the quiet posting, the waiting posting, the place where professional soldiers marked time until the real decisions were made somewhere else. He was beginning to doubt that assessment. And the observation post was a concrete box sunk into the top of a bluff overlooking what the operational maps called Sector 7. The Allies, he would later learn, had already given it a different name. The post had a horizontal slit of a window, 8 inches high and 4 feet wide, like a wound cut into the concrete, offering a commanding view of roughly 3 miles of coastline and the gray expanse of the English Channel beyond. Inside, 2 wooden chairs, a field telephone bolted to the wall, a shelf holding binoculars, range-finding equipment, a logbook, and a tin cup that perpetually contained cold coffee. Outside, barely audible through the thick concrete, the sea. Kellner had spent a great deal of time in this box over the past months. He had watched summer fade into autumn, autumn collapse into a bitter winter, and winter reluctantly loosen its grip into what the locals were calling spring, though it felt more like winter with ambitions. He had watched the gray water change color with the seasons and the weather. He had watched the tides come and go with the mechanical reliability of something that did not know there was a war on and would not have cared if it did. He had also watched the defenses. This was the part he did not discuss with Major Dieter Vogt. Vogt commanded the regiment with the particular confidence of a man who had never been proven wrong in a way he was willing to acknowledge. He was 48 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the square jaw and steady gaze that appeared regularly in recruitment posters. He had fought in France in 1940, a campaign that had been, from Germany's perspective, almost insultingly easy, and he had drawn certain conclusions from that experience and had been drawing on them ever since. Vogt believed in the Atlantic Wall the way some men believe in God, not with specific knowledge of its mechanisms, but with a deep, load-bearing faith that it would perform its function when the moment came. He talked about it with the vocabulary of the propaganda ministry, which was not a coincidence. The propaganda ministry had, over several years, performed the remarkable feat of making the actual construction and the official description of that construction into 2 entirely separate realities that happened to share a name. The official version was a seamless chain of reinforced concrete and steel, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, an impenetrable barrier behind which the Reich could operate without fear of disruption from the West. The men who built it, and the officers who commanded the men who built it, understood that the gap between the official version and the physical reality was substantial and growing. But understanding this and saying so were different acts with very different consequences, and most men had learned which one the system rewarded. Vogt had not walked the sector the way Kellner had walked it. He had toured it, which was a different thing. A tour is conducted along prepared routes, with prepared stops, with a guide who has been instructed on what to show and what to skip. Kellner had not toured. He had walked, alone with maps in weather that ranged from unpleasant to miserable, sunward at times of day, when no one was expecting an officer to appear, and the natural disorder of a military position at rest was visible rather than composed for inspection. He had sat in bunkers and estimated what could be seen from them and what couldn't. He had stood on the beach and looked back at the positions and measured their fields of fire with his own eyes and the range-finding equipment he carried out of habit. He had done this because on the Eastern Front, the difference between an accurate understanding of your defensive position and an official understanding of your defensive position was measured in casualties, and he had learned the cost of that difference in a currency he had no interest in spending again. Kellner knew the real one. He had walked every meter of it in their sector. He had climbed into bunkers and measured angles of fire. He had stood on the beach and looked back at the positions and identified, with the trained eye of a man who had defended actual ground against actual enemies, exactly where the weaknesses were. He had done this not out of pessimism, but out of professional habit, the same way a surgeon examines a patient not to find reasons for despair, but because accurate information is the only foundation on which sound decisions can be made. The habit had been trained into him in the hardest possible classroom. At Stalingrad, he had watched an entire army disappear, not primarily because of what the Soviets did to it, though the Soviets were thorough, but because of what the German command structure did to itself, the systematic suppression of accurate information about the position's viability, or the reports that were filed and forwarded and noted and never acted on, the officers who had said the true thing and been relieved for saying it, replaced by men who were more enthusiastic about saying the thing that was wanted. He had survived Stalingrad not because he was braver than the men who hadn't survived it, but because he had spent the weeks preceding the encirclement reading the situation honestly rather than officially, and had made a series of small decisions based on his honest reading that happened to put him on the right side of several situations that killed men who were operating on official information. He did not regard this as wisdom. He regarded it as arithmetic. What he found in the Normandy defenses did not fill him with confidence. The minefields had gaps, not small gaps, passable gaps, gaps that a determined and reasonably well-informed attacker could exploit without exceptional difficulty. The fields of fire from the strong points overlapped in some places and failed to cover critical ground in others. The bunkers themselves were well built where they were finished and dangerously incomplete where they were not, which was more places than the maps indicated. And there was the other thing, the thing he had reported, the thing that still sat in the file on Vogt's desk, acknowledged and unaddressed, like a fault line running under a building that everyone had agreed not to talk about. It was 3 weeks before the invasion when Kellner found it, and he had been conducting what he privately called his audit, his systematic personal survey of the sector's actual defensive capability versus its official defensive capability, when he noticed something that the contour maps had obscured, a shallow valley, barely a valley really, more of a depression in the bluff line, running at an angle that created a corridor roughly 400 meters wide, where the trajectory of every gun in his battery's reach was blocked by terrain. He checked his calculations 3 times. He checked them a 4th time. He borrowed Metz's range-finding equipment and checked them a 5th time. The corridor was real. It was undefended. It was exactly the kind of feature that a competent attacker with aerial reconnaissance would find and use. He walked through it himself on a gray afternoon in mid-May, and felt the specific discomfort of a man moving through a space that should not exist, that the map said did not exist, that the official defensive plan had apparently never accounted for. From inside the corridor, looking back at the German positions, he could see why. The angle was subtle, the kind of thing that would look fine on a 2-dimensional map and only reveal itself to someone standing on the actual ground in the actual light of the actual afternoon. measuring actual angles rather than theoretical ones. He wrote it up that same evening. A precise, technically detailed report, 3 pages with diagrams. He brought it to Fote the following morning. Fote read it. Kellner watched him read it, watched the eyes move across the page, watched the moment when the implication registered. A slight tightening around the jaw. So almost imperceptible, the kind of micro-expression that most people miss, but that Kellner, after years of reading faces in high-stakes situations, caught with ease. Fote set the report on his desk. He looked at Kellner for a moment with an expression that was not quite dismissal and not quite anger, but somewhere between the two, in the territory of a man who has been shown something inconvenient and is deciding how to respond. "I'll forward this to division," Fote said, "with a recommendation for remediation." A pause. Not long, long enough. With a notation that it has been reviewed. Kellner understood in that moment, with the complete clarity that sometimes comes when a thing you have suspected is finally confirmed, that the report would go into a file and the file would go into a drawer, and the drawer would remain closed. Not because Fote was a bad officer, not because he was stupid or cowardly, but because acknowledging the gap in a meaningful way, requesting resources, demanding engineering work, escalating the issue formally, would require him to tell Berlin that the sector he commanded had a significant defensive flaw. And telling Berlin things like that in the spring of 1944, in the context of the Atlantic Wall that Hitler had personally declared impregnable, was a career-ending act. The system had been designed, whether intentionally or through accumulated institutional cowardice, to punish accuracy. Reports that confirmed the narrative were welcomed. Reports that contradicted it were buried, qualified, or reframed until they no longer contradicted anything. Kellner returned to his observation post, sat in his wooden chair, turned and looked at the sea for a long time. He thought about a concept he had first encountered in the mathematics classroom of a Frankfurt gymnasium. Before the war had made mathematics into something you used to calculate shell trajectories and casualty rates. The concept was called cascading failure. It described what happens in complex systems when a small unaddressed problem allows a larger problem to develop, which in turn creates the conditions for a larger problem still. Each failure creating the environment for the next until the entire structure collapses in a sequence that seems sudden from the outside, but was, in retrospect, perfectly predictable from the beginning. He thought about the undefended corridor in the bluff line. He thought about the file in Vogt's drawer. He thought about what those two things, taken together, he meant for the men under his command when the day arrived that everyone was waiting for and no one was adequately prepared for. He thought about how the corridor and the file were the same problem expressed in two different forms. The corridor was a physical gap in the defense. The file was a systemic gap in the institution's ability to address physical gaps. And a systemic gap was more dangerous than a physical one. Because a physical gap could in principle be fixed if someone decided to fix it, while a systemic gap actively prevented the decision to fix anything from ever being made. He thought about cascading failure. He thought about what it looked like when every gap in a system was connected to every other gap, not by design, but by the accumulated weight of every decision that had prioritized institutional comfort over operational accuracy. He sat at his desk and stared at the sea and understood that he was living inside the early stages of a cascade and that there was nothing he could do about it except document it accurately and wait for the mathematics to complete itself. Unteroffizier Georg Metz had been in the Army since 1936, which meant he had been in it long enough to have no illusions left about any of it. He was 38 years old, compact and deliberate in the way of men who have learned that economy of motion and economy of speech are both forms of survival. He had fought in Poland, in France, and on the northern edge of the Eastern Front before a case of frostbite, severe enough to require 2 amputated toes, had sent him west. And he walked with a slight irregularity in his gait that was only noticeable if you knew to look for it. Metz and Kellner had arrived in the same transfer group and had developed, over 8 months of shared watch rotations in shared proximity to both danger and boredom, the particular kind of friendship that forms between men who have each independently arrived at inconvenient conclusions about the world and are relieved to find someone else who has done the same. They did not talk about their conclusions directly at first. They talked around them. They discussed logistics and technical matters and the quality of the food and the peculiarities of local weather. But the conclusions were there, present in the subtext of every conversation, acknowledged without being stated, or to the way a room can feel cold without anyone mentioning the temperature. Metz was not, by any conventional measure, a man of obvious distinction. He did not give speeches. He did not inspire in the way that officers in training manuals inspire, not through presence or charisma or the particular kind of aggressive confidence that armies select for and promote. What he had instead was something rarer and, in Kellner's estimation, more valuable. He was consistently accurate. Not about everything. No one was accurate about everything, but about the specific category of things that mattered most, which was the difference between what a situation officially was and what it actually was. He could look at a supply chain and tell you in 3 minutes where it was going to break down. He could examine a gun position and identify the angle from which it was vulnerable before anyone had fired at it. He had been doing this for 8 years across 3 separate theaters of the war, and he was still alive, which was its own kind of testimony to the practical value of seeing things as they are. The direct conversation happened on the evening of June the 5th. They were sitting outside the observation post on an ammunition crate that served as a bench, sharing a cigarette in the way that men share cigarettes when there aren't enough cigarettes to justify one each. The storm that had dominated the past 2 days was subsiding. The wind had dropped from violent to merely persistent, and the sea was still rough but had a different quality. Not the savage chop of a full storm, but the residual restlessness of water that has been through something and hasn't quite settled back. Kellner was watching the water the way he always watched it, with the specific focused attention of a man looking for information rather than beauty. He had been doing this long enough that the sea had stopped being a visual experience and had become a kind of language he was trying to read. Metz passed him the cigarette. "You've been watching the water for an hour," Metz said. "I've been watching it for 8 months, Kellner said. "Tonight specifically." Kellner took a draw and thought for a moment before answering. "The wind changed this afternoon, from the northwest to the west-southwest. The barometric pressure has been rising since 1400 hours. The wave period is lengthening." He handed the cigarette back. "The storm is breaking in the right direction for a crossing." Metz was quiet for a moment, processing this. He had grown up on the Baltic coast. He understood what those observations meant in combination. "The meteorological office says conditions are unsuitable for the next 4 to 5 days," he said. Not as an argument, more as a fact placed on the table to see what Kellner would do with it. "The meteorological office is working from models built on historical patterns. The Allies have weather stations in Iceland and across the North Atlantic. Their forecasts are more accurate than ours. They would know about this window." He handed the cigarette back. "If I were commanding the invasion force, and I had been waiting for the right conditions, and I saw what I see right now in that water, I would not wait for a better night." Metz smoked. The sea moved. "So," Metz said finally, and the single syllable contained everything: the acceptance, the understanding, the recognition of what was being said without being said. "So," Kellner agreed. There was a long silence between them. Not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that 2 men can share when they've arrived at the same place by different routes and there's nothing left to navigate to. Then Metz said the thing that neither of them had said before, the thing that had been present in every conversation they'd ever had, the load-bearing fact around which all their careful, indirect language had been circling for 8 months. "We're not going to win this," Metz said. Flat, or quiet, not dramatic, just accurate. The tone of a man stating a measurement, not delivering a verdict. "The defense we have is not the defense the maps describe. The reinforcements we're promised are either unavailable or unable to move without air cover we don't have. The panzer divisions that are supposed to counterattack are waiting for authorizations that will come too late through a command structure that doesn't agree with itself about anything important." He took a final draw and pressed the cigarette out against the ammunition crate. "The question isn't whether we hold the beaches. We won't hold the beaches. The question is, how many men die finding that out?" Kellner did not answer immediately. He looked at the sea, which was doing exactly what he had expected it to do, with the waves settling into the longer period that preceded calmer water, the surface tension dropping, the whole body of water shifting in the way it shifts when a change of conditions is underway. "When it starts," Kellner said, "stay close to me." It was not a heroic statement, it was a practical one. It was the closest either of them would come, in that moment, to expressing what they actually felt about the situation and about each other, and about the shared project of getting through whatever was coming with as many of their men alive as possible. Metz stood, adjusted his coat, and looked at the sea one last time. "You should write in your log," he said. "Whatever you put in there tonight, be accurate. Someone should have a record of what we actually knew and when we knew it." He went back inside. Kellner stayed a while longer. When he opened his logbook and wrote the date, the time, the wind direction, the barometric pressure, the wave period, he wrote a brief note about the change in conditions. He wrote, almost as an afterthought, a single line that he would find again years later, in different circumstances, and understand differently than he did in the moment of writing it. "If I am correct about tonight, then everything I have said about this position is also correct, and no one listened to any of it." He closed the log. He looked at the horizon, which was dark and offered nothing. He thought about the undefended corridor. He thought about the file in the drawer. He thought about what those two things and all the things like them meant when you added them together and looked honestly at the sum. Then he went inside, sat in his wooden chair, and then waited for the world to prove him right in the worst possible way. At 3 in the morning on June the 6th, the first reports came in about paratroopers. The field telephone woke Kellner from a shallow and unsatisfying sleep. The voice on the other end was clipped, controlled in the way of a man working to maintain composure. Paratroopers had been sighted, multiple locations, inland from the coast. There were reports of gliders. There was confusion about numbers and objectives. The voice said, in the careful language of a man who has received orders about what not to say, that the situation was being assessed. Kellner asked the question that mattered. "Naval contacts?" A pause. "Nothing confirmed." He set the phone down and pulled on his boots and coat and went to the observation slit and looked at the sea. The sky to the east was beginning the first, almost imperceptible suggestion of lightning, that change that isn't quite light yet, but is the absence of the deepest dark. The sea was no longer the violent gray-black of the storm. It had calmed, as he had expected it would, into a heavy, purposeful swell. The kind of sea you could move a fleet through, if you were determined and had been waiting long enough. He raised his binoculars. The horizon was dark. He stood there for a long time, looking. The paratroopers inland, the high command said, were the main event. A diversion, perhaps. A prelude to something at the Pas de Calais, where the real blow would fall. That was the consensus. That was the intelligence estimate. That was what folk would say when Kellner reached him. If he reached him, which he should do, which he would do. Yeah, but not yet. Not quite yet. He kept the binoculars on the horizon. Somewhere behind him, in the bunkers and gun pits of Sector 7, his men were waking up to the sound of distant aircraft, to the crump of distant explosions inland, to the low, persistent vibration in the air that had no clear source but was present everywhere, like a sound too low to hear that you felt instead in your sternum and your back teeth. He heard voices outside, men speaking in the clipped, uncertain tones of soldiers trying to calibrate a situation they haven't been briefed for. He heard someone ask where the paratroopers were. He heard someone else say they were probably just scattered drops, bad weather navigation. It didn't mean anything. He heard the particular quality of silence that follows a statement no one believes. And the inland reports continued to filter through. Small groups of paratroopers here, a crashed glider there, some farm roads blocked, some communications cut. The pattern of it was consistent with a wide, deliberate drop rather than a navigational accident, but the high command was committed to the interpretation that fit the intelligence estimate, that any activity in Normandy was a diversion, that the real attack would come somewhere else, at a place they had decided in advance was more logical and more strategically coherent, and therefore more consistent with how a rational enemy would behave. The enemy, Kellner had found, did not always behave rationally. Sometimes they behaved correctly, which was different. He stood at the slit and watched the horizon and waited. And the horizon, in the last minutes before sunrise on the 6th of June, 1944, began to change. It started as nothing. A subtle difference in the quality of the darkness at sea level, a thickening along the line where water met sky. He had looked at this horizon hundreds of times. He knew what it looked like when it held nothing. This was not that. He adjusted the binoculars. Focused. Refocused. The thickening became shapes. The shapes became distinct. The distinct shapes became more distinct shapes behind them, and behind those more still, and as the sky continued its slow, indifferent brightening, the full scope of what he was looking at began to resolve itself out of the dark and into something that his training, his experience, and the complete inventory of everything he had ever known about naval forces and amphibious operations was entirely inadequate to process. It was not a fleet. The word fleet implied something finite, something that could be counted, something with edges. What Franz Kellner was looking at through his binoculars in the first light of June the 6th had no visible edges. It extended from one boundary of his vision to the other and kept going. It was not ships in a line or ships in a formation. It was ships the way the sea was water, as the fundamental condition of the thing rather than a feature of it. He lowered the binoculars. He raised them again. Nothing had changed. If anything, in the seconds between lowering and raising, more had appeared. The light was growing, revealing more of the water, and every additional square mile of water that the growing light made visible was covered in the same way as the rest. Warships in the distance, the massive silhouettes of battleships and cruisers, identifiable by their profiles even at this range. Closer in, the faster, angular shapes of destroyers running interference in groups of 3 and 4. And behind them, filling the middle distance and the far distance and everything beyond, that to the edge of what the binoculars could reach. The landing craft. Hundreds of them. Then hundreds more. Then more beyond those. So many that the individual shapes dissolved into a single dark mass that moved with the slow, unstoppable momentum of a geological event. He felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt since Stalingrad. Not fear, exactly. And fear was something he had metabolized years ago into a kind of background radiation he barely noticed anymore. This was something different. This was the specific, cold, clarifying sensation of a man who has been right about something terrible and is now watching the proof of his accuracy arrive with complete indifference to anything he might prefer. He reached for the field telephone. He thought about the undefended corridor in the bluff line. He thought about the file in Vogt's drawer. He thought about what Metz had said the night before. The question isn't whether we hold the beaches. The question is how many men die finding that out. He picked up the phone, and on the other end, after a short delay, Vogt's voice, steady and expectant, the voice of a man who still believed in the wall. Kellner closed his eyes for half a second. It opened them, looked one more time at the horizon that was no longer a horizon, but a continent of steel moving toward him across the water. "Major," he said, "the invasion is here. I am looking at it. There is no other word for what I am looking at." A silence on the line. In that silence, Kellner heard everything he had known for months. He heard the undefended corridor that no one had fixed. He heard the file in the drawer that no one had opened. He heard every accurate report that the system had been designed to absorb without acting on. Every inconvenient truth that had been qualified and forwarded and noted and filed and forgotten in the service of a collective agreement to believe in something that was not true. He heard all of it, compressed into a few seconds of silence on a field telephone, while the largest armada in the history of human warfare assembled itself outside his window, and the last moments of the world he had known counted themselves down to nothing. "How many ships?" Vogt asked. Kellner looked at the water. "All of them," he said. "All the ships." The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds. Kellner counted them. Not deliberately. His mind had been doing things like that since Stalingrad. Measuring gaps, registering intervals, cataloging the small quantifiable details of a situation when the larger picture was too vast to hold all at once. 4 seconds of silence from a man like Vogt, a man who prided himself on the immediate, decisive response, told Kellner more than any words would have. It told him that Vogt had heard something in his voice that could not be dismissed. "No, be specific," Vogt said finally. The command voice. The voice that had been trained over decades to project certainty, regardless of what was happening behind it. How many vessels? Estimated class. Bearing. Kellner pressed his binoculars back to his eyes. The light was growing with a speed that felt almost aggressive, as though the sun itself had a stake in making sure every detail of what was happening in the channel was visible to the men who needed to see it most and could do least about it. Bearing west-northwest across the full width of observable horizon, he said, "Class, all classes. I can identify capital ships, minimum 2, possibly 4. Multiple cruiser profiles. Destroyer screen, I count." He stopped. Counting was the wrong word for what his eyes were trying to do. Going to the destroyer screen is too numerous to count at a glance. And beyond them, he paused again, searching for language adequate to the observation. Beyond the warships, the transport and landing craft extend to the limit of visibility in every direction. Major, I want to be precise with you. I have looked at this for 60 seconds, and I am telling you that the number of vessels I can see from this position alone is greater than every estimate I have seen in any intelligence briefing since my arrival in this sector. Another silence, shorter this time. "I am contacting Division," Vogt said. "Maintain observation. Do not open fire without my authorization." The line went quiet without going dead. Kellner could hear, faintly, the sound of Vogt working another telephone, talking to someone further up the chain, who the muffled sounds of a command structure waking up to something it had been assured would not happen in this place, in this way, on this particular morning. Kellner kept his binoculars on the fleet. He was aware, in the way you become aware of things at moments of genuine extremity, of the physical details of where he was standing, the cold of the concrete floor through the soles of his boots, the smell of the bunker, damp cement, machine oil, stale air, coffee that had been cold for hours, the slight draft through the observation slit, carrying salt and the particular raw smell of disturbed water. These details registered with unusual clarity, the way everything becomes unusually clear when the brain understands at some level below conscious thought that it is in the process of recording things it will not easily forget. And the fleet kept coming. Metz appeared at the entrance to the observation post at approximately 5:40 in the morning. He had not needed to be called. He had been awake since 3 like Kellner, and he had done what Kellner had done, gone to the nearest window, looked at the sea, and understood. He stepped inside and stood beside Kellner at the observation slit and looked through his own binoculars for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "There it is." Not a question, not surprise. The voice of a man for whom a long-standing prediction has been confirmed, which produces not satisfaction, but a specific kind of grief. The grief of being right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. "Vogt is on with Division," Kellner said. "What are they saying?" "Nothing yet. Knock, they're assessing." Metz lowered his binoculars. He turned and looked at the crew of the observation post. 3 young soldiers who had also gotten to windows and also understood and were now standing in a cluster near the telephone equipment, watching Kellner and Metz with the particular expression of men who are waiting to be told that what they're seeing is not what it looks like. Kellner recognized that expression. He had worn it himself once, outside Kharkov, waiting for someone senior to him to explain that the Soviet armored column on the horizon was smaller than it appeared, or further away than it seemed, or going somewhere else. No one had explained that. The column had been exactly what it looked like. He turned back to the slit. The landing craft were beginning to form up. Even at this distance, in the growing light, he could see the movement. The larger vessels holding position, while the smaller craft maneuvered around them, forming into lines, into waves, organizing themselves with a purposeful efficiency that spoke of rehearsal, of planning conducted over months and executed with the precision of an industrial process rather than a military one, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly what it was. The order to open fire did not come. At 5:53, Kellner made a decision. He was aware that it was the kind of decision that could end careers in peacetime and end lives in wartime, and that Vogt would have opinions about it that he would express at volume when the opportunity arose. He was also aware that every minute of delay was a minute the fleet used to close distance, to organize, asked to establish the conditions for what came next. He was aware that his guns, his men, his training, and his professional obligation all pointed in one direction. He picked up the internal line to the gun pits. "This is Kellner. All batteries, prepare to engage. Target, naval formations, bearing west-northwest. I want firing solutions on the capital ships first, then the destroyer screen. Move." A moment of hesitation on the line, someone confirming they had heard correctly, that this was a real order and not a drill. "This is not a drill," Kellner said. "Execute." He heard the change in the sounds outside the bunker, the shift from the mechanical ambient noise of equipment on standby to the specific purposeful sounds of men doing the work they had been trained to do. The scrape of shell casings, the clank of bridge mechanisms, the shouted numbers of range and bearing, the particular human sounds of a gun crew coming to life. Metz was at the window beside him. "Folk won't like this. Folk can court-martial me when we're done. If we're done." "If we're done," Kellner agreed. The first gun fired at 5:58. The sound was enormous in the way that artillery is always enormous. Not just loud, but physically present. A concussive pressure that moved through the chest and the sinuses and left a ringing silence in its wake that lasted exactly long enough to hear the shell in flight before the second gun fired and the cycle began again. Kellner tracked the first rounds through his binoculars. He saw the plumes of water rise in the middle distance. Short, he could tell immediately. Range estimation on a target this unprecedented required adjustment. He called corrections. The gun crews responded with the trained discipline of men who had spent months drilling precisely for this moment. And in the repetition of fire and correction and fire again, there was a strange comfort. The comfort of competence, of a skill being applied, of the world briefly reduced to numbers and angles, and the satisfying mechanical certainty of ballistics. The third salvo was better. The fourth, better still. And then, on the fifth, something happened that nobody in the gun pit had expected to happen, and that Kellner himself, for all his hard-won realism, had not been certain would happen. They hit something. The USS Harmon, a destroyer running close interference for the landing craft formations, caught a shell on her forward section at approximately 6:04 in the morning. For sure, the hit was clean enough that even at distance, Kellner could identify it with confidence. The flash, the secondary smoke, the characteristic list that follows structural damage to a warship's forward compartment. Through his binoculars, he could see the immediate response on the surrounding vessels. The slight perturbation of formation as the nearest ships registered the hit. The small adjustments, of course. In the gun pits, the cheer was spontaneous and genuine. Kellner heard it through the concrete walls, heard it build from the first shout to a full-throated collective exultation. The sound of men who have been waiting and drilling and doubting and waiting again for months, discovering in a single moment that their training was real, their guns were real, their capabilities were real. He did not cheer. And he watched through his binoculars. He watched the Harmon, damaged, beginning to slow, beginning to fall back from the formation. He watched the gap she left in the line. He watched what happened to that gap. It closed, not slowly, not after a pause while the surrounding ships registered the loss and made adjustments. It closed the way a body of water closes when you remove a hand from it. Immediately, completely, as though the space had never existed. Another vessel moved into position. The formation continued. The lines of landing craft maintained their organization. The capital ships held their distance and their bearing. The whole enormous apparatus continued its approach as though the Harmon had not been a ship at all, but a small inconvenience that the system had been designed to absorb without interruption. Or this was the moment, not the sighting of the fleet at dawn, not the first shell, not the phone call about the sleeping man. This was the moment when Kellner understood completely what he was facing. It was not the size of the fleet, though the size was beyond anything he had imagined. It was not the firepower, though the firepower was absolute. It was the indifference. The system on the other side of the water had been built with so much redundancy, so much depth, so many layers of backup and contingency and reserve, that removing one of its elements produced no visible effect on the operation of the whole. It was a machine that had been engineered to function in the presence of failure, which meant that his best efforts, his training, his men, their months of preparation, could not impair it, could not reach it. When he was not fighting ships, he was fighting the principle of excess capacity, and excess capacity did not have a weak point you could target with artillery. The cheering in the gun pits faded as the men saw what Kellner was seeing. Faded and did not resume. They fired for 40 minutes. Kellner managed the fire with the methodical focus of a man who understands that doing the job correctly is the only remaining form of control available to him. He called targets and corrections and bearings with precision. His crews responded with discipline. They were good men, these gunners, not the elite of 1940, not the veterans of the early campaigns, but men who had been trained thoroughly and who, in this moment, performed their function without flinching. They registered 3 more impacts in those 40 minutes. Confirmed hits, visible impacts, visible damage, the specific signatures of shells connecting with steel at ranges that would have been considered exceptional in any gunnery exercise. In any other context, against any other target, it would have been a creditable performance. Against this fleet, it was the equivalent of throwing stones at a moving train and hitting it twice. The train did not notice. The train did not slow. The train kept coming. For every shell that found a target, 100 found water. For every vessel they touched, 1,000 continued untouched. The mathematics were not complicated. They were not even close. It was in the 23rd minute of the engagement, during a brief pause for a barrel that was running hot, that Metz came to stand beside Kellner and said the thing about the ammunition. He said it quietly, without drama, the way Metz always delivered information that mattered. "I've been checking the magazines," he said. "At current rate of fire, we have approximately 4 hours of ammunition at normal sustained rate, 3 hours and 15 minutes at the rate we're currently operating." Kellner took the binoculars from his eyes and looked at Metz. "The resupply convoy," he said, "was supposed to arrive yesterday. I made inquiries 2 days ago. The road from Saint-Lô has been under air interdiction for 72 hours. There are 3 trucks stopped on the road with engine damage from strafing. No replacement convoy has been arranged because the logistics command was not expecting an engagement before the weather window closed." Metz paused. "Which is to say, we are fighting the largest naval invasion in history with the ammunition we happen to have on hand. And no one thought to check how much that was before this morning." Kellner looked back at the fleet. The landing craft were closer now. He could make out individual shapes without binoculars. The angular silhouettes of the Higgins boats, the larger profiles of the LCTs, the whole armored, engine-driven apparatus of industrial-age amphibious assault bearing down on the coast with a momentum that owed nothing to chance and everything to planning that had been underway for years. "Tell the crews," Kellner said. "Tell them what?" "That we fire until we can't, and we make every round count." Metz nodded. He started to move, then stopped. He turned back. "There's something else," he said. "I checked the fuel situation for the gun tractors. If we need to displace, to move the batteries, we have fuel for approximately 12 kilometers. And the nearest fallback position is how far? 18. Kellner absorbed this in silence. He thought about the undefended corridor in the bluff line. He thought about the file in Vogt's drawer. He thought about the logistics convoy that wasn't coming. He thought about 12 kilometers of fuel and an 18-kilometer distance to safety. He added these things together in his mind with the same methodical precision he applied to firing solutions, and he arrived at a number that expressed, in purely practical terms, exactly how much margin for error they had been given for the defense of Sector 7. The number was not encouraging. "Tell the crews," he said again, "and tell them they're doing their job." The naval bombardment began in earnest at approximately 6:20. Kellner had been expecting it. The fleet had not closed to this distance to observe. The warships had been patient, holding back, organizing, waiting for the landing craft to form up into their assault waves. And now the patience was done. He saw the capital ships turn, saw the big guns elevate, saw the flashes begin along the line of the fleet in a sequence that looked, from a distance, like a slow electrical storm moving across the horizon. Then the world came apart. The shells arrived before the sound did, which was always wrong and always shocking, no matter how many times you experienced it. The physical reality of the impact preceding by a full second the auditory evidence that something had been fired. the ground moved. Soaring not shook, moved in the specific way that ground moves when something enormously energetic has been deposited in it, a rolling, heaving displacement that went up through the feet and the legs and registered in the spine as something between sensation and language. The body's way of expressing what the mind was slow to process. The first impact was perhaps 200 meters to the west. The second was closer. The third shook the observation post hard enough to crack a line across the concrete of the eastern wall, a fissure that ran from floor to ceiling in less time than it took to register the sound. Kellner grabbed the doorframe. Dust fell from the ceiling in a fine continuous rain. The field telephone rang, vibrating against its bracket. Through the observation slit, the world outside had changed its quality. There was now a constant haze of disturbed earth in the air, and beyond it, the sea. And the sea was still full of ships, and the ships were still coming. He reached for the telephone. It was fogged. The conversation that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but Kellner would remember it in precise detail for the rest of his life. Fogg's voice had changed, not broken. Fogg was not a man whose voice broke, but altered in a register just below the surface, in the quality of the pauses between words, in the specific way he was managing his breathing. The command voice was still there, but it was being maintained now by effort rather than habit, which was a different thing entirely. "What is the status of your batteries?" Wernon Fogg asked. Kellner gave him the status. "Operational guns, 80 rounds remaining, crew casualties so far. 2 wounded, none dead, numbers that would not hold at current bombardment intensity. And the fleet? Still approaching. Landing craft are in assault formation. First wave will reach the shore." He looked at the water, made a calculation. 12 to 15 minutes. A pause. "I have been in contact with Division," Fogg said. "Division has been in contact with Corps." Kellner waited. "The 21st Panzer is on alert." Another pause. "They are awaiting authorization to move." "From whom?" The silence that followed was longer than it should have been, long enough to be its own kind of answer. But Fogg supplied the actual answer anyway, in the flat tone of a man reading a casualty report. "Authorization must come through OKW Army High Command. The Panzer divisions in the West are designated as reserve under direct Führer control. They cannot be committed without his personal authorization." Kellner looked through the observation slit at the landing craft, which were now close enough that he could see the bow waves they were pushing. He looked at the sea behind them, which was full of more landing craft, and behind those more still, the endless conveyor belt of the Allied logistical system delivering its product to the shore with a regularity that owed nothing to improvisation. "Is he available?" Kellner asked. He kept his voice neutral with care. The silence before the answer was the longest of the morning. Longer than the silence when Kellner had first reported the fleet. Longer than the silence when Vogt had received the report about the defensive gap and set it in a file. "He is not currently available," Vogt said. Kellner set the binoculars down on the shelf. He did not speak for a moment. He looked through the observation slit at the landing craft, which were now close enough to count individually, and at the sea behind them, which was full of more. He looked at the sky, which belonged entirely to someone else. A constant overhead traffic of Allied fighters and bombers and transports, moving in both directions with the organized efficiency of a logistics system that had been running for months. And he thought about what those 4 words meant in their full dimension, not just as a military communication, but as a summary of everything that had brought them to this exact moment on this exact morning. The largest amphibious invasion in history was making contact with the European continent. The men responsible for defending that continent had a single armored reserve capable of influencing the outcome. That reserve was sitting in an assembly area waiting for authorization. The authorization required one phone call from one man, and that man was asleep, not dead, not incapacitated, not engaged with another crisis of equal magnitude. Asleep, in a bed, in Germany, while the war he had started arrived at its mathematical conclusion on a beach in Normandy. Kellner thought about all the points in the chain where accurate information had entered the system and been quietly neutralized. The report about the defensive corridor, filed and forgotten. The intelligence estimate, suppressed because the numbers were inconvenient. The ammunition convoy, strafed and not replaced. The fuel that reached 12 kilometers when the fallback position was 18. Each of these was a place where the system had been given a chance to correct itself and had instead continued on its original course. Each was a small failure, creating the conditions for the next. And at the end of all of them, a sleeping man and a Panzer division waiting by its tanks for a phone call that was not going to come in time. The system had not been defeated by the Allies. It had been defeated by the accumulated weight of every decision it had made to protect itself from accurate information, and the bill for all of those decisions had come due simultaneously on a beach in Normandy on the morning of June the 6th. "I understand," Kellner said. "Thank you, Major." He set the phone down and turned to Metz, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand its content. "The Panzers?" Metz said. "Waiting." Metz looked at the sea for a moment. Then he turned away from the window and began checking the ammunition counts with the quiet efficiency of a man who has moved past the point of surprise and into the territory of practical management of an untenable situation. Kellner turned back to the slit. He watched the sky, which was full of Allied aircraft. He had tried to count them at dawn. He had stopped when the count stopped being informative and started being a measure of something else entirely. Not a military assessment, but an industrial one. He thought about the factories, not abstractly, but specifically the way you think about a mechanism when you are an engineer trying to understand how it works. He had read, in a technical intelligence summary 6 months ago, the figures for American industrial output, the monthly production numbers for aircraft and tanks and trucks and ships. He had filed those numbers in the category of things that were probably exaggerated. He looked at the sky. He no longer thought they were exaggerated. For every German aircraft that had taken off this morning in response to the invasion, the Allies had put 40 in the air. He did not know the exact ratio, but he knew it was something like that. And the reason was not a failure of German courage or German engineering. The German engineers were exceptional. The German pilots were brave. The reason was simpler and more absolute than either of those things. The factories. American factories in 1944 were producing aircraft at a rate that German planners, looking at the numbers honestly, had acknowledged privately was impossible to match. Not difficult, not challenging, impossible. The assembly lines in Detroit and Willow Run and Long Beach were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing aircraft with the same methodical abundance that they had previously applied to automobiles, because the skills and the infrastructure and the industrial culture that built one could build the other, and the country that had built more automobiles than any other country in history was now applying that capacity to a different product with similar results. Germany had exceptional aircraft. There were not many of them. America had adequate aircraft. There were an effectively unlimited number of them. He thought about the tanks he could see coming ashore in the growing distance. The Allied armor crawling up the beach, some equipped with flotation devices that had allowed them to drive directly out of the water. Some with specialized equipment for breaching obstacles and detonating mines. He knew the reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were genuinely superior machines. Better armor, better guns, more dangerous in a direct engagement. Allied tank crews knew this and feared it. But for every Tiger that rolled off a German production line in 1944, the Americans were producing dozens of Shermans. The Sherman was a lesser machine in almost every technical specification. It caught fire more easily. Its gun was less powerful. Its armor was thinner. Allied tankers called it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter, because it lit first time every time. None of that mattered when there were 10 of them for every Tiger. The Tiger won the engagement. The Sherman won the campaign. The difference between the two was the difference between craft and production, between the exceptional and the adequate. And in a war of attrition, which this had always been, which every war eventually becomes, adequate in unlimited quantities beats exceptional in limited quantities every time without exception. The industrial equation of the war had been decided before the first shot was fired at Normandy. It had probably been decided before the first shot of the war itself. What was happening on the beach below was simply the physical expression of a calculation that had been complete for years. He thought about the propaganda posters. He thought about the language of final victory and the unshakable will of the German people, and the decadence of the democracies and all the rest of the vocabulary that had been the ambient noise of the past decade. The constant background assertion that ideology and determination and racial character were forces capable of overcoming material reality. He looked at the sky. He looked at the sea. He looked at the beach, where the first waves of landing craft had reached the shore and the battle for Normandy had begun. He thought about ideology meeting a naval bombardment, and he thought about what the result of that meeting was, and it was not a complicated thought. The first wave hit the beach at 6:31. Kellner watched it from the observation slit with the specific focused attention of a professional soldier observing an operation and the specific hollow feeling of a man watching something unfold exactly as he knew it would. The ramps dropped. The men came out into water that was chest deep in some places and over their heads in others, weighed down by equipment, moving toward a beach that was defended by men who had been doing nothing for months but prepare for exactly this moment. The German positions opened fire with everything they had. For approximately 20 minutes, it appeared the defense was holding. The water at the edge of the beach turned a color that Kellner did not look at directly. The first wave was pinned, taking catastrophic casualties, unable to move forward and unable to go back. We're caught in the specific hell of an exposed beach with fire coming from prepared positions. The German machine guns were performing exactly as they had been designed to perform. The interlocking fields of fire were functioning correctly. The men in those positions were doing their jobs with a professionalism that, under other circumstances, would have been the subject of training manuals. But the landing craft kept coming. The second wave was already forming up behind the first. Behind the second wave, a third. And behind all of it, the fleet, patient and inexhaustible. The deep reserves of a system that had been building toward this moment for 2 years in factories on the other side of an ocean. Then the destroyers moved. Necker Kellner watched them through his binoculars and felt a response he had not anticipated. Something that was not admiration exactly, because admiration implied a context in which the thing being admired was not actively trying to kill him, but something in that register, a professional recognition of something being done well. The destroyers, American, running fast, flags visible at the masthead, were doing something that no naval doctrine Kellner had ever studied would have sanctioned. They were closing the shore, not maintaining the cautious distance of capital ships providing indirect fire support, closing it, aggressively, at speed, driving toward a beach that was still being contested, pushing their hulls into water shallow enough that some of them were dragging bottom. By any conventional measure, it was reckless to the point of professional irresponsibility. It was also, he could see immediately, changing everything. The destroyers' guns were firing at point-blank range into the German strongpoints. Not the indirect, plunging fire of long-range naval artillery, but direct, flat trajectory fire. The kind that goes precisely where it is aimed, and that prefabricated concrete bunkers were not designed to absorb from a direction perpendicular to their intended fields of fire. He watched a strong point on the eastern end of the beach take 3 direct hits in rapid succession and go silent. He watched another disappear into a cloud of cement dust and smoke and not reappear. He lowered the binoculars. He thought about the destroyer's maneuver, about the decision that had been made somewhere on those ships to violate every principle of fleet protection in the service of a single overriding objective: get the men off the beach. He thought about the commanders who had made that decision, who had looked at the situation and determined that the right thing to do was the thing that the rule book said not to do, because the situation demanded it and the objective required it, and sometimes the right answer is the one that the system was not built to produce. He thought about the difference between a system that could produce that decision and a system that could not. The American naval commanders had been given a problem: men dying on a beach in front of defensive positions that standard fire support was not adequately suppressing, and they had responded to the actual problem rather than the official version of the problem, which was that destroyers maintained safe distance from contested shores. They had looked at what was actually happening and done what was actually required, regardless of what the standing orders said about it. He thought about Vogt, who had received the report about the defensive corridor and put it in a file because following the rules of institutional self-preservation was more important than addressing the problem the report described. He thought about the difference between those two responses to inconvenient information, one that acknowledged reality and acted on it, and one that managed reality and filed it away. He thought about which one he was watching when. He thought about all of this in approximately 4 seconds, looking through his binoculars at the German strongpoint that was dissolving under direct naval fire. Then he turned back to his own guns and kept doing his job. At 7:15, a shell hit the number 2 gun pit. The sound was different from the naval bombardment, closer, more specific, the particular intimate violence of a direct hit rather than the general violence of near misses. Kellner felt it through the floor before he heard it, and then heard it in a way that registered in the chest rather than the ears. He was at the telephone immediately, calling the pit. No answer. He moved to the door of the observation post. Outside, the air was different, thicker, an air carrying the chemical smell of explosives and the darker smell of things that had been burning that should not have been burning. Through the smoke, he could see the gun pit, or what remained of it. The gun itself was damaged, but possibly repairable. The crew, he counted again. 2 men standing, 1 prone, moving, 2 prone, not moving. He went to them. Metz was already there, moving with the efficient urgency of a man performing triage, sorting the living from the dead, with the practiced calm that comes from having done it before. Kellner knelt beside the nearest fallen man, a 20-year-old from Bavaria named Streicher, who had joined the unit 4 months ago, and who had, Kellner now understood, been doing his job correctly up until the moment the job ended. Metz looked up from the other side of the pit and gave Kellner a look that contained a complete accounting of the situation without requiring words. Kellner stood. He looked at the remaining guns, at the remaining men, at the stacks of ammunition that Metz had calculated at 4 hours this morning, which had now been burning for over an hour at high intensity. He looked at the beach where the battle had shifted in the way that battles shift when the momentum moves. Not a clean transition, but a gradual, irreversible change in the character of the fighting. The defense still present, but no longer holding. The offense still costly, but no longer stopped. He picked up the field telephone and called Vogt. "Major, I need to report 2 dead and 1 seriously wounded in gun pit 2. Battery is at 60% operational capacity. 1 ammunition at approximately 2.5 hours remaining at current rate. I am requesting guidance on displacement." Vogt's voice, when it came, had completed the transformation that had begun in their earlier conversation. The command voice was still present. It would always be present. It was too deeply trained to disappear entirely. But it was hollow now, operating on habit rather than authority, a performance of function by a man whose relationship to the system producing that function had fundamentally changed. "There is no order to displace," Vogt said. "Major?" "There is no order to displace, Kellner. The order is to hold position and continue to engage. We have 2.5 hours of ammunition. We have fuel for 12 kilometers. The fallback position is 18. If we wait for displacement orders until the ammunition is exhausted, we will not be able to reach the fallback." A pause. "I understand your situation. Do you have an updated authorization on the Panzers?" The pause before the answer was the longest yet. "I have been unable to reach a division for the past 40 minutes, Vogt said. "The lines are intermittent. When I last had contact, the authorization had not yet been received." Kellner looked through the observation slit at the beach, then at the sky, which was still full of Allied aircraft in their constant traffic. He thought about a question he had been forming since the morning, a question that he had been approaching from multiple directions, and that was now, in the context of 2 dead men in a gun pit, in an ammunition supply with 2.5 hours remaining, in a fallback position 6 kilometers beyond their fuel range, fully formed. "Major," Kellner said, "is there any action we can take from this position with the resources available to us that will meaningfully change the outcome of what is happening on that beach?" The silence this time was not hesitation. It was something else. It was a man who had built his professional identity on a particular understanding of the world, discovering, in real time, that the world did not match the understanding, and finding that the gap between the two was not small enough to bridge with effort or will or the correct application of doctrine. "No," Vogt said, and his voice in that single syllable, Hamun, was the voice of a different man than the one who had answered the phone that morning. I don't believe there is. Kellner set the phone down. He stood at the observation slit for a long time, watching the beach, watching the sky, watching the sea. The sun was fully up now, indifferent and bright, illuminating the whole scene with the impartial clarity of daylight that falls on everything equally and cares about none of it. He opened his log. He wrote the time. He wrote the status of the battery. He wrote the ammunition count and the fuel status and the casualty figures. He wrote these things precisely accurately in the clean handwriting of a man who has been told since childhood that records matter and who has spent enough time in situations where records were the only thing that survived to believe it. Then he paused, to pen on paper, and added one more entry. A system built to silence accurate information will always be ambushed by accurate outcomes. We did not lose this position today because the enemy was stronger. We lost it because we spent months building our defenses on the foundation of what we needed to believe, rather than what we could actually see. He closed the log. Outside, the bombardment continued. The beach continued. The fleet continued. The sky continued its endless Allied traffic, the aircraft passing over in their dozens and scores with the mechanical regularity of a production line, which was exactly what they were. Metz appeared in the doorway. We need to talk about what happens next, Metz said. Kellner looked at him. He looked at the sea. He looked at the log closed on the shelf. Yes, he said. So we do. The conversation about what happened next lasted 11 minutes. Kellner tracked it in the log afterward, the way he tracked everything: time, duration, the specific sequence of decisions, and the reasoning behind them. Not because anyone had told him records of this kind were required, but because he had come to believe, somewhere in the long education of the Eastern Front, that the only honest thing a soldier could offer the future was an accurate account of what he had actually done and why. Metz stood in the doorway of the observation post. Kellner stood at the shelf with his hand resting on the closed log. Between them, through the observation slit, the battle continued its work with the indifference of a natural process. Something like weather, something like erosion, in the systematic application of force over time, producing the inevitable result. The way I see it, Metz said, we have three options. He laid them out with the economy of a man who had thought them through before speaking, which Kellner had come to recognize as Metz's consistent method. He never spoke about a problem until he had already finished thinking about it, which meant that by the time words arrived, the thinking was done, and what remained was simply the transmission of conclusions. Option 1, continue firing until the ammunition was exhausted, then attempt displacement with fuel insufficient to reach the fallback position. This produced a known outcome. They would exhaust their combat capability, become immobile, and be overrun or captured in a location that offered no tactical advantage to anyone. On option 2, displace immediately, accepting that they were doing so without orders, using the fuel they had to reach as far as it would carry them, and deal with the consequences of unauthorized withdrawal at whatever later point those consequences presented themselves. This assumed there would be a later point. It also assumed the roads were passable, which was not guaranteed given air interdiction. Option 3, destroy the remaining guns and equipment to prevent capture, withdraw the able-bodied men on foot, and arrange surrender for the wounded who could not move. Kellner listened to all three without interrupting. When Metz finished, he was quiet for a moment. You left out option 4, Kellner said. Which is? Continue as ordered and accept the outcome. Metz looked at him steadily. I didn't leave it out, he said. I didn't count it as an option. The decision took the form it always takes when a professional soldier in an impossible situation finally arrives at the boundary between following orders and keeping people alive. It did not arrive dramatically. It did not announce itself with moral clarity or the satisfying weight of a cinematic moment. It arrived quietly, practically, in the form of a series of small acknowledgments that assembled themselves into an unavoidable conclusion. Kellner picked up the field telephone one more time and called Vogt. The line rang for a long time. When Vogt answered, his voice had the quality of a man operating at some remove from himself, performing the functions of command from a distance that had not been there that morning. Major, I am informing you that I am initiating destruction of the remaining battery equipment and organizing a fighting withdrawal with the mobile elements of my command. The wounded who cannot move will be arranged for surrender to Allied forces when contact is made. I am documenting this decision and my reasoning in the unit log. A silence. Kellner. Vogt's voice. Not the command voice now. Something older and more tired. You understand what you are doing? Yes, sir. You understand that I cannot authorize this? Yes, sir. I am not asking for authorization. I am providing notification. Another silence. Longer. The log, Vogt said finally. Make sure it is accurate. It was the closest thing to a blessing that the situation allowed. Kellner recognized it as such. It will be, he said. He set the phone down for the last time. When the destruction of the guns took 22 minutes. It was not a simple thing. Destroying equipment that men had maintained and operated for months, equipment that represented the physical substance of their military function. There was something almost ceremonial about it, not in any way that was spoken or acknowledged, but present in the careful, methodical way the crews went about the work, the specific attention they paid to doing it correctly and completely. This was the final professional act of men performing their last duty to weapons that had, for a few hours that morning, performed exactly as designed. The breech mechanisms were removed and destroyed first, then the elevation and traverse systems. Then the barrels were rendered permanently inoperable, with charges placed by men who had spent months learning the precise tolerances and vulnerabilities of these weapons, and who now applied that knowledge in reverse. The ammunition that remained, 2 hours' worth, Metz's careful accounting had been accurate to within minutes, was stacked and prepared for demolition. When it went with a sound that felt disproportionately small for what it represented. A series of sharp reports, a rising column of black smoke, and then the guns were simply objects, heavy and useless, no longer weapons but debris. Kellner watched the smoke rise and thought about the undefended corridor in the bluff line. He thought about it not with bitterness exactly, but with the specific quality of attention that comes when you have been right about something for a long time, and the rightness of it has finally been made undeniable by events. The corridor was still there. It would still be there when the Allied forces came through it, which they would, probably before the end of the day. He had known this for weeks. He had written it in a report. The report had sat in a file. The file had sat in a drawer. The drawer had remained closed. He thought about what that sequence meant, not for him personally, but as a phenomenon, a system that had been designed to receive accurate information and had instead been operated in a way that quietly neutralized anything that failed to confirm what the system already believed. Not through malice, not through stupidity. Through the accumulated pressure of an institutional culture that had learned over years to reward the bearers of comfortable news and manage the bearers of uncomfortable news until the uncomfortable news either went away or became someone else's problem. He had told Vogt about the corridor. The corridor had not been fixed. The corridor would now be used. Every step in that sequence had been predictable. Every step had been predicted, and no step had been prevented. They moved out at 8:40 in the morning. 11 men, the survivors of the gun crews and observation post staff, the men who could walk. Metz led them in a column, moving east along the ridgeline, away from the coast, using the terrain for cover with the instinctive fieldcraft of experienced soldiers. Kellner walked at the rear, where officers went when moving through contested ground, watching the column, watching the terrain behind them, watching the sky. The sky was still full of Allied aircraft. It was a different kind of full than it had been at dawn. Less the overwhelming shock of the initial assault wave, and more the settled routine presence of a force that had established air superiority and was now simply maintaining it. Fighters in pairs and fours, bombers in their disciplined formations, the occasional transport slower and lower, delivering things to places where things were needed. All of it moving with the organized efficiency of a system that had been running for months and knew what it was doing. Kellner watched them and thought, for the last time that morning, about the production figures. He had been thinking about them since 5 in the morning, when the scale of the fleet had first made the thought unavoidable. But the thought had fully crystallized now, walking east with 11 men through contested terrain under a sky that belonged entirely to someone else. The ratio was something like 40 to 1. 40 Allied aircraft sorties for every German one on this day. The reason was not courage. The reason was not tactics. The reason was the same reason the fleet had filled the horizon and the ammunition convoy had not arrived, and the panzers were still sitting in their assembly area waiting for a phone call. The reason was production. Factories running 3 shifts in countries that had not been bombed into rubble, staffed by workers who had not been conscripted, and converting raw materials into finished products at a rate that Germany's planners had understood privately for 2 years was beyond any realistic possibility of matching. They had known. The people responsible for sending men to defend the Atlantic Wall had known what the production figures showed. They had seen the numbers. Some of them had tried to say so. Those people had been managed, transferred, demoted, silenced, their reports forwarded and filed and forgotten. Because the system was not built to hear what they were saying. The system was built to sustain the belief that ideology could overcome arithmetic, that willpower could compensate for production capacity, that a determined people could defeat a materially superior enemy through the force of their conviction. The sky offered a definitive commentary on that proposition. They reached the edge of a small wood at approximately 10 in the morning and stopped to rest. Metz moved back along the column, checking on the men, distributing water from his canteen in the careful, equal portions of a man who has thought about resource allocation under stress. Kellner found a fallen trunk at the edge of the trees, sat on it, opened his log, and wrote for several minutes, updating the operational record, noting positions and times, documenting the withdrawal with the same precision he applied to everything. When he finished, he did not close the log immediately. He held it open on his knee and looked at what he had written, and then, on an impulse that felt necessary, turned back several pages to the entry from the night of June 5th. The one he had written after the conversation with Metz on the ammunition crate, after the wind had changed and the barometric pressure had risen. If I am correct about tonight, then everything I have said about this position is also correct. And no one listened to any of it. He read it twice. Then he turned to a fresh page and wrote the thing he had not planned to write, had not thought about writing, but found himself writing with the directness of a man who has run out of reasons for indirection. He wrote about the undefended corridor. He described it precisely. Location, dimensions, the angle that created the dead ground, the specific defensive consequence of leaving it unaddressed. He wrote about the report he had submitted to Vogt, the date, the content, uttered the response. He wrote about the intelligence estimate that had been buried because the numbers were inconvenient. He wrote about the ammunition convoy that had not come, the fuel that reached 12 kilometers when the fallback was 18, the Panzer Division waiting by its tanks for a phone call from a man who had been asleep. He wrote all of it with the precision of a legal document, because that was what it was. A record made by someone who had been present and paying attention of what had actually happened and why, stripped of justification and sentiment and the comfortable language that institutions use to make their failures sound like something other than failures. And then he wrote one more thing. The question I cannot stop returning to is not why we lost. The answer to that is written across the entire sky above me. The question I cannot stop returning to is this. At what point did the people responsible for these decisions know they were wrong? And what did the system do to them when they said so? Because I reported the corridor. I was told it was noted. Others before me reported other things. The production gaps, the Air Force attrition, the impossibility of the strategic position, and were told those things were also noted. The system was given accurate information at every point. It produced files, it produced drawers, it produced forwarded notifications and noted concerns and moving on. And on the beach below this wood, this morning, the outcomes of all those choices arrived simultaneously, with the punctuality of mathematics. He closed the log. Metz was standing a few feet away, now watching him with the quiet patience of a man who has learned that some things need to be finished before they can be interrupted. There's something ahead, Metz said. You should see it. The beach below the wood was a small one, a narrow strip of sand accessible from the bluff by a path that switched back down through coastal grass and rock. It was not one of the assault beaches. It was a small, incidental stretch of coast, the kind of place that appears on military maps only as terrain and on civilian maps as a local landmark with a name that only people who grew up nearby could tell you. The tide had brought things to it. Equipment, mostly. The debris of the assault. The things that armies shed when they moved from ships to land. The packaging and rigging and miscellaneous material of a large organized operation, leaving its margins behind. But there were other things too. Things that had been men. Kellner was not unfamiliar with this site. The Eastern Front had provided extensive experience with what battlefields look like after they are done being battlefields and before anyone has addressed what they leave behind. He had learned to look at it with the specific focused detachment that allows a soldier to process what he is seeing without being destroyed by it. Not callousness, but the professional management of a response that, if allowed its full expression, would make it impossible to continue functioning. He was applying that detachment now when Metz stopped beside a figure at the waterline and said quietly, "This one." Kellner walked over. The soldier was American. Young, 19, perhaps 20, the specific youth of a face that had not had time to develop the architecture that experience builds over years. He was on his back at the edge of the water, the small waves running up to his boots and retreating with the indifference of tides that do not adjust their schedule for what has happened on the shore above them. His equipment was mostly intact, which told Kellner something about how he had died. Not in close combat, but at distance, in the water or at the waterline, before he had the chance to use what he was carrying. In the breast pocket of his jacket, visible because the pocket had been torn partially open, was a folded piece of paper and the edge of a photograph. Kellner did not touch them. He stood over this young man and looked at him for a long time and felt something move through him that was not grief exactly and not guilt exactly, but something in the register between them. A recognition, specific and inescapable, that what he was looking at was not an enemy casualty in the abstract, but a particular person who had been somewhere else not very long ago, who had been in a specific place with specific people who knew his name and would at some point be notified of his absence. He thought about where this young man had been 6 months ago, probably somewhere in England, in a training camp, learning the mechanics of the assault he would eventually be asked to execute. Before that, somewhere in America, a city or a town or a farm, living the specific daily texture of a life that had nothing to do with Normandy or the Atlantic Wall or artillery batteries overlooking the English Channel. He had family. The photograph in his pocket said so. He had at some point been a child, and before that he had been whatever children become in the space between childhood and the thing that sends them to beaches like this one. He had had thoughts and preferences and habits and small private irritations and moments of happiness that Kellner would never know anything about, and that were now simply over. He thought about Stryker, the 20-year-old from Bavaria, lying in the gun pit. He thought about Brand, 18 years old, angry and frightened, only waiting in the remains of the battery position for soldiers from the other side to come and process him through a system he had been told was the enemy. He thought about the specific, terrible democracy of what a battlefield produces, the complete indifference to which side you're on, what you believe, who is waiting for you at home. Both young men had been sent here by systems larger than themselves, for reasons that had been decided by people they had never met, on the basis of calculations that had been running for years before either of them was old enough to understand what a calculation was. Both had done what they were told. Both had performed their functions. The outcomes were different, but the process that had produced them was identical. The same mechanism, operating in opposite directions, delivering the same category of result. He thought about who had made those decisions. Not the men in the field, who had done what they were ordered to do, the ones further back, the ones who had drawn the plans and set the objectives and made the calculations and sent the young men out to be the physical expression of those calculations on a beach that none of the decision makers would ever stand on. He thought about those people and about the specific distance between where they sat and where the results of their decisions ended up, and about what that distance did to the quality of decision-making over time. He thought about the file in Vogt's drawer and understood, perhaps for the first time completely, that Vogt was not the end of that chain. Vogt was just one more link in a chain that ran from this beach all the way back to offices in Berlin, where men in clean uniforms made decisions about positions they had never visited, based on reports that had been filtered through the same system that had turned Kellner's survey of the defensive corridor into a notation that something had been reviewed. He turned and climbed back up the path. Metz came up behind him without a word. They rejoined the column and kept moving. At approximately noon, they reached a crossroads where a field dressing station had been established in a barn by a country road. There were German wounded there, men from various units, gathered by the tide of a battle that had pushed them all in the same direction. A medical officer, young and exhausted, he worked with the focused efficiency of someone who has suspended everything except the immediate technical demands of the task in front of him. Kellner stopped the column and assessed the situation. It was here that Metz came to him with the information he had been carrying since they left the battery. "I need to tell you something," Metz said. They stepped away from the column. Metz looked at Kellner with the expression he wore when he had thought something through completely and had arrived at a conclusion he knew the other person was not going to find comfortable. "When we left the battery," Metz said, "Fisher and Brand couldn't walk. I told them what we were doing and why. Fisher understood. Brand," he paused. "Brand is 18 years old. He's been in the Army 6 months. He doesn't understand why German soldiers would surrender to Americans when the war isn't over." He looked at Kellner steadily. "He thinks we abandoned him." Kellner absorbed this. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. I told him that being captured by the Americans was survivable and that the alternative options were not. I told him that the decision was made by his commanding officer based on an accurate assessment of the situation and that his commanding officer would be accountable for it. And he was still angry when we left." Kellner nodded. He thought about Brand, a face he could place, a voice he recognized, a young man who had arrived 4 months ago with the particular earnestness of someone who believed completely in the version of the world he had been given. Sarah, who had never been offered the opportunity to develop the kind of relationship with reality that Kellner and Metz had spent years building, who had been given, instead, a version that was cleaner and more logical and more susceptible to will and determination than the world Kellner had been standing in all morning. "He'll understand eventually," Kellner said. "If he lives long enough," Metz said. "Yes," Kellner said, "if he lives long enough." They reached the fallback position at 3:40 in the afternoon. It was not the position on the map. The fuel had run out at 12 kilometers, exactly as calculated, and they had walked the remaining 6 under Allied air cover that Metz managed with a combination of careful route selection and fieldcraft that doesn't appear in manuals because it is too specific to particular situations to be generalized into doctrine. No casualties on the march. In Kellner's assessment, this was the most significant tactical achievement of his day. A major from a different regiment was there, older than Vogt, with the look of a man who had seen the Eastern Front and returned with the same settled quality in the eyes that Kellner recognized from his own mirror. The major looked at Kellner's group and nodded. "How many?" he asked. 11 mobile. 2 wounded left for surrender at the battery position." The major nodded. He did not ask about the guns. He already knew. "Find space inside. Oughta get your men food if there is any. There's water." Kellner thanked him and saw to the men. When they were settled, sitting against the walls of the farmhouse in the particular boneless exhaustion of men who have been running on pure necessity for 10 hours and have just been given permission to stop, he went outside. The sun was moving west. The light had that late afternoon quality that makes everything look more permanent than it is. The long shadows and the golden clarity that artists favor, and that soldiers regard with the suspicion appropriate to anything that makes a landscape look peaceful when it isn't. He could still hear the battle. Not close. The front had moved, consolidated, established itself along lines that would hold until the next Allied push. He could hear aircraft. He could hear, very faintly, the deep irregular percussion of naval gunfire continuing its work somewhere to the west. He sat against the wall of the farmhouse with his log on his knee and read back through the entries of the morning. The wind direction from the night before, the first sighting of the fleet, the ammunition count, the phone conversation with Vogt about the panzers, the fuel calculation, the decision to destroy the guns. He read it all with the specific attention of a man checking his own work, verifying that the record was accurate, that what was written matched what had happened. It did. He thought about the question he had written in the wood. At what point did the people responsible for these decisions know they were wrong? And what did the system do to them when they said so? He turned it over, looking at it from different angles. One, the way you examine a problem when you are not sure you have fully understood it yet. The true answer was that they had known for a long time. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. The intelligence about Allied production capacity had been available. The reports about Atlantic Wall deficiencies had been filed by him and by others like him in other sectors. The logic of the air war, the irreversible attrition of the Luftwaffe, the impossibility of protecting ground forces from a sky owned by the enemy, was not a secret to anyone willing to read the numbers honestly. The mathematics of the Eastern Front, the grinding calculation of losses against Soviet industrial output, had been visible since at least 1943 to anyone not determined to look away from it. He knew from his time at Stalingrad was that the officers around him had understood the position was untenable months before the encirclement was complete. He had seen them understand it. He had watched them write reports and attend briefings and sign off on plans that bore no relationship to what their own observations had told them was true. And he had understood, watching them do this, that the choice was not between knowing the truth and not knowing it. Everyone in that room knew the truth. The choice was between saying the true thing and accepting the consequence of saying it, or saying the expected thing and accepting the consequence of that instead. Most had chosen the second option. Most always did. It was not cowardice exactly. The men who made those choices were not cowards in any other sense of the word, had demonstrated physical courage in situations that would have broken anyone who was simply afraid. It was something more specific and more universal than cowardice. It was the calculation, made quickly and mostly below conscious thought, that the personal cost of the true thing exceeded the personal cost of the comfortable thing, and that therefore the comfortable thing was, from the individual's perspective, the rational choice. The problem was that a system composed entirely of individuals making that rational choice produced collectively irrational outcomes. Each individual was protected, the system was destroyed, and the young men who had no access to the individual calculations that produced the collective outcome ended up on beaches and in gun pits paying the bill for decisions they had no voice in. The system had known. And the system had produced files and drawers and forwarded notifications and noted concerns, because the system had been constructed in a way that made action on accurate information more costly than inaction. To act on the true information would have required admitting that the true information contradicted the ideology, and the ideology was not a thing that could be contradicted without consequences that extended beyond the professional into the personal, and beyond the personal into territory that no one in the system was willing to enter. So the files went in the drawers, the gaps stayed in the bluffs, the ammunition convoys got strafed, and no replacement was arranged. The panzers waited for phone calls that came too late from a man who had been asleep. And on a beach in Normandy, on the morning of June the 6th, 1944, the outcomes of all those choices arrived simultaneously, with the punctuality of mathematics. Some point in the late afternoon, Metz came out of the farmhouse and sat down beside him against the wall. They sat together without speaking for a while, looking at the light on the fields and listening to the distant sounds of a battle that had already been decided even if it had not yet been completed. "Fisher and Brand," Kellner said finally. "They'll be processed," Metz said. "Americans are organized about these things. You could have come with us." Metz was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man stating a calculation rather than defending a choice, "I ran the numbers. Surrender to the Americans, high probability of survival, withdrawal without sufficient fuel, lower probability of reaching fallback, a continued engagement without ammunition, near certainty of death or capture under worse conditions." He looked at the fields. The arithmetic wasn't complicated. "No," Kellner said, "it wasn't." "It never is," Metz said. "That's the part that stays with you. Not the fear, not the noise. Just how simple the numbers actually were once you were willing to look at them honestly." He stood, adjusted his coat, and paused before going back inside. "The log," he said, "whatever you wrote in there today, that was the right thing to do. Even if no one reads it for 50 years, especially if no one reads it for 50 years. He went inside. Kellner looked at the log in his hands. He thought about Metz's word. Willing, not able, not permitted, not ordered, willing. That was the whole of it, he thought. Not capability, not intelligence, not courage. The willingness to look at what the numbers actually said rather than what you needed them to say. The willingness to write the report and give it to Fote, knowing Fote would file it. The willingness to look at the horizon at 5 in the morning and name what you saw there, even when the person on the other end of the telephone needed it to be something else. The willingness to make the decision about the guns and the fuel, and Fisher and Brand on the basis of what was true rather than what was permitted. He turned to a fresh page and wrote the last entry of June the 6th. The battle today was decided before it started, not by anything that happened on the beach, but by everything that happened in the months before anyone fired a shot. Every piece of accurate information that entered the system and was neutralized. Every report that was forwarded and forgotten. Every corridor that stayed a corridor because fixing it required admitting it existed. The men who died today did not die because the enemy was stronger, though the enemy was stronger. They died because the system they served had been operating for years on the principle that its own comfort was worth more than their lives. I do not know what to do with that knowledge. I only know it should be written down, clearly, by someone who was present, so that it cannot be entirely erased by the people who will need to write the history of this day in a way that makes it mean something other than what it actually means. This is what it actually means. We knew. We were told. We filed the telling away. And here we are. He closed the log. The light was failing now, as for the golden quality of the afternoon, deepening toward the blue-gray of early evening. Somewhere to the west, Normandy was changing hands. The largest armada in history was still delivering its cargo to the shore. The Panzer Division was moving at last, far too late, into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers that would decimate it before it reached the front. The Atlantic Wall, the impregnable fortress of propaganda and concrete and national will, was in the process of becoming a historical footnote. Kellner sat against the farmhouse wall and listened to the last sounds of the day's fighting, and felt beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the cold clarity that had been with him since 5 in the morning, something that was not quite peace but was perhaps its practical equivalent. The specific settled quality of a man who has done what he could with what he had, who has been honest when honesty cost something, who has written down the true thing when the pressure to write the comfortable thing was considerable, and who can therefore sit in the evening of a day that was as bad as any he has known and know, at least that he did not lie about it. Franz Kellner survived the war. He went home to Frankfurt in the summer of 1946 and did not speak publicly about June the 6th, 1944, or about the months that preceded it. He found work as an engineer. He was good at it. The methodical analysis, the precise observation, the refusal to let preferred conclusions override accurate measurement served him well in work that rewarded those qualities consistently. He declined several times invitations to join veterans organizations. The invitations eventually stopped. He kept the log. When he died in 1987, it was found by a niece who brought it to a historical archive in Frankfurt. A researcher read it. In her published account of the document, she quoted a single passage, the entry written in the wood above the beach, the morning after the guns were destroyed. A system that cannot hear accurate information will always be surprised by accurate outcomes. She found it, she wrote, difficult to stop thinking about. She did not elaborate on what she thought it applied to beyond 1944. She did not need to. And the log had outlasted the system that had produced the events it documented. The question it asked, about what happens to people who tell the truth inside institutions built to neutralize the truth, had not been answered by the 60 years between the writing and the reading. It was still being asked. Kellner had known it would be. He had written it for the person who would be reading it long after June the 6th, 1944, had become history. The person far enough from those events to see them clearly, close enough to the present to recognize where the same logic was still operating. He had written it because the only honest thing a man can do when a system has been built to prevent the truth from reaching the people who need it is to write the truth down in a place where it might outlast the system. Heck, the truth was simple. It had always been simple. It did not require a fleet filling the horizon to make it visible, though that helped. It did not require two dead men in a gun pit, though that was part of it. It required only a willingness to look at what was actually there, rather than what you needed to be there, and to write it down accurately, and to keep writing it down accurately, no matter how many drawers it ended up in. That was the price of clarity. It was not a comfortable price. It was not a safe one. Kellner had paid it in the specific coin of a man who spends his professional life being right about things that no one acts on, who watches the outcomes of ignored warnings arrive with the punctuality of mathematics, yeah, who carries the log through a war and home through the peace, and keeps it in a drawer of his own until a niece finds it 30 years after the morning it was written. But it was the only currency that purchased anything of permanent value. The gap in the bluff had been real. The file in the drawer had been real. The sleeping man and the waiting panzers and the ammunition convoy that never arrived had all been real, and they had all been documented, and the documentation had survived. And here it was in the hands of someone reading it long after everyone involved had made their last accounting with what they had done and why. The fleet had filled the horizon, and the wall had fallen, and the war had ended, and the men who had died on the beach had died and could not be undone. But the question remained. At what point did the people responsible know they were wrong, and what did the system do to them when they said so? Kellner had written it into a log on a morning when the answer was being delivered by 7,000 ships and 14,000 aircraft, and the full unrestrained industrial capacity of a world that had decided, finally and irrevocably, that the file and the drawer were not enough. He had written it for the future. The future was reading it now.